Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for day 3 of EY's Blockchain Summit. My name's Duncan Westland. I look after blockchain research and development in EY, which is hopefully appropriate because today is the technology day. So this is where you take off your jackets and roll up your sleeves, and we really get down to some zkP stuff. Now, the speakers always ask me, how should I pitch my talk? Should I make it for really complex maths, or should I make it really easy? And I always say, I don't actually care, because the audience is varied, and so should the talks be. So I'm hoping, even if you don't know your nullifier key from your Dankshard, or you're polishing up your Boolean hypercube, there'll be something for everyone. And it's certainly an exciting range of speakers that we've got lined up for you, except for the first one, which is me. But after that, it'll rapidly improve, I'm sure. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We'll filter out the rude ones, and then we'll get through as many questions as we can. And actually, if you see me looking strangely to the left like that, that's just me reading the questions, so don't worry about that. Okay, I think we can get on with our first talk. Okay, just before we start, a little word about if you're chasing CPE credits, just to let you know, it's the same as before. We'll launch 3 polls per CPE credit. Participants must attend the full session, and participants must answer at least 3 polls per CPE credit to receive the full credit. Okay? And actually, for the first talk, these are the objectives. I won't read them all out, but you can read them there. And yeah, let's crack on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about privacy. As you know, zkP is used in blockchain for scaling and for privacy, or combinations of the two. My focus is often in privacy rather than scalability, and privacy is actually a really hard thing to get right. And I just wanted to share my thoughts on that subject with you for the next half hour or so. So this is the agenda. It's in 4 parts. The first part, somewhat controversially, I don't think total privacy is going to happen. I'll say why, and you can argue with me at the end. Then we'll unpick what we mean by privacy a little bit more. We'll talk about privacy and anonymity, and I think that's important for teasing out how we get through technical solutions to this problem. Then really a section on kind of anti-patterns, things I see people do that I don't think are sensible things to do. I mean, you can form your own view, of course, but I think I'll justify it. And then finally, a section on where we actually have to be careful when we're designing these things. These are things that can go wrong in a big way if we don't get them right. So I want to talk about that. I would say it's perfectly possible to do privacy properly on a blockchain if you think about it carefully, think about your solutions, and you get them right. And the other thing I'd say is none of this is purely a technical problem. Actually, the technical part of the problem was solved some time ago. It's how things interact that's important. So let's start with the first section. Total privacy isn't going to happen. So what does Westland mean by that? Well, actually, before I get into that, this is a difficult subject, because to fully understand this, you'd have to be a lawyer, you'd have to be an accountant, and you'd have to be an engineer. Now, I'm only an engineer, so I can speak authoritatively on technical stuff, But if I appear to be giving you legal advice, I'm certainly not. I'm not a lawyer. If I appear to be giving you financial or regulatory advice, I'm not an accountant. I can give you technical advice, but I'm not doing that today. This is for interest and education, okay? But to solve this problem, we do kind of need to veer into each of these disciplines. So we'll see how we get on. Right, let's start off with total privacy and why this can be problematic. Now, as I said earlier, technically, you can run a blockchain application in total privacy using zero-knowledge proofs. This is something we cracked pretty well a few years ago. And whilst there's still a lot of technical work to be done, making things more efficient, making it easier to incorporate other business logic, the fundamentals are there. We know how to do it. So this is, as you can see on the screen, a typical private transaction. You've got Alice sending something to Bob, and because it's a blockchain, that'll be a thing of value. So that's a value transaction. We've also got Eve trying to learn things about that transaction. By the way, just a note to cryptographers, please, sometimes we have Alice, Bob and Charles here. No, it has to be Eve because it's short for eavesdropping, you see. So just bear that in mind. Now the thing is, if we've got a fully private transaction, what does Eve learn? Well, she doesn't learn the sender. She doesn't learn the recipient. She doesn't learn what's being transacted between Alice and Bob at all. She will probably know that a transaction has happened, and that's kind of okay. And actually, for proper zero-knowledge solutions, probably Bob won't even know who Alice is. It can be that private. And that's great, and that's kind of nice, because we like our stuff to be private, generally speaking. So what's wrong with this? Well, it runs up against a bit of a problem when we try to do this in a business situation. So if you're a business, you have responsibilities. You have to know your customer, you have to have anti-money laundering controls, and you have to be able to show that you've implemented those correctly. So, you know, here's a kind of scenario where if you were using a fully private transaction, you wouldn't even know who'd sent you money. And when you get asked to prove that your anti-money laundering or your KYC controls are in place, well, you've kind of failed. So this is a problem. This is not something you're allowed to do. And this is where we have to remember, just because it's decentralized, it doesn't mean you can do what you like. Decentralization doesn't let you do illegal things. Therefore, full privacy is not something that's going to happen. That doesn't mean we can't do privacy properly. It just means we have to be a bit more nuanced about how we go about it. And the rest of this talk is how we achieve that nuance. So let's move on and talk about that a little bit. So the first thing I want to draw out, and I've said a little bit about this before, but it's worth repeating, is privacy versus anonymity. What's the difference between those two? Well, in the blockchain world, a transaction is private, or it's not, it's public, but an entity is what's anonymous. So this is the person or thing doing the transaction. They're either anonymous or they're not. They're identified as the opposite of anonymous. And the nice thing about that is you can use these two dimensions and you can draw a sort of Boston Consulting Group kind of grid that I'm showing you now. And this is actually quite a useful way to think about it, because until now, a lot of our work has been focused in the bottom left of this grid, where I put the question mark, where things are both private and anonymous. You don't know anything about the transaction. You don't know anything about the transacting parties. That is not going to fly in a regulated environment. And most of us live in countries where there are pretty good rules about what you can and you can't do around these things. So let's zoom up to the opposite corner where we're identified and public. Now this is actually, if you want to comply with regulation, this is a pretty good place to be, because you can do things like, because you know who's sending what to whom exactly. So you can check sanctions lists, you can do KYC, you can verify an entire transaction history if you want. It's all good. The problem is it's not private, and capitalism leads to competition, leads to the need for privacy. As sure as night follows day. You can't run a business where everything you do is public. That just doesn't work. If your competitors know everything you're doing, they'll steal a march on you. So the use cases in this corner are actually quite small. I mean, they're not none. You can do things like, you know, if you want to show provenance of your goods and you want to do that in a public way, this is where you operate. But we'll generally not be able to work there. So let's try going downwards to the light grey area where things are public and anonymous. This is quite good here. I can still check against sanctions lists before I do a transaction with somebody. Is their address on a sanctions list? If yes, don't transact with them. But I can still see all the transactions. I still can see an entire transaction history. It's not really private enough. Which brings us to the last square. So the last square is where organisations are identified but transactions are private. Now this is quite interesting because this is very like real life. And if you think, you know, EY is not a secret organisation. It keeps things private, but generally you know when you're dealing with EY, but you may not know how much we spend on pencils, for example, because we don't want our competitors to know that and get cheaper pencils. That would be bad. So this is the sort of area where things get interesting, and this is the sort of area where we should be designing solutions. So the next question is, how can we design solutions around there? And I'll show you some of our thinking as it's developed over the last year on that. So there's actually quite a few ways you can do that. One is decentralized. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. One is decentralized access control. I've spoken a little bit about that before, so I'll go over it fairly quickly. There's something called proof of allow listing. There's swaps, and I'm sure there's other ways that will be invented, and we should, as engineers, be cognizant of this and be following it. So let's look at a few of these. So the first one is decentralized access control, and the idea here, it's a kind of walled garden solution, nothing wrong with that, but what it aims to do is it aims to control who can send stuff from layer 1 in the blockchain into the private layer 2, and who can do the reverse, who can take money out. So it's controlling money going in and it's controlling money going out. And that's kind of, that's not dissimilar to how a bank works if you think about it. So if you open a bank account, the bank will do a whole load of KYC on you. It'll get you to fill in forms, it'll get you to identify yourself, and it will kind of check that you meet certain criteria before it gives you a bank account. Decentralized access control is a bit like that, because the bank similarly doesn't do that sort of work every time you want to take out £10 to go down the pub. It only does it at the beginning, and, well, only at the beginning really. Decentralized access control is a similar thing. What it aims to do is it aims to give you a certificate, and this can be a fairly bog standard X509 certificate that proves you are the sort of person or organisation that can transact in this environment. In other words, you're not going to cause any money laundering problems or other problems like that. you can obtain a certificate, and I'll come back to that, and having obtained a certificate, it's perfectly simple to get a smart contract to verify that certificate. So from this point on, it's fully decentralized. I can take my certificate, I can give it to a smart contract, it can verify it. If it verifies correctly, and also I prove that I'm the correct owner by signing something with my private key, then I can get access. Everyone else in that walled garden knows that everyone who's got access has undergone at least a degree of validation. I think it's fair to say quasi-decentralized, because the question arises, who do I get that certificate from? Well, the nice thing is, you know, there are lots of people out there, we call them certification authorities, whose job it is to give certificates like that to people. And if you're, say, a doctor or a lawyer and you want to sign documents or prescriptions, they will do quite a lot of detailed checking that you are who you say you are and give you a certificate. And there's several you can try. So there isn't one organisation controlling entry. So it's quasi-decentralised. You could use exactly the same process here for decentralised access control. So this is a good starting point. Can we do more? Yes, we can. Decentralised access control is kind of once you're in, you're free. You can't get out again easily, but while you're in the private layer 2, you can transact freely. You could, if you wanted, you could actually, you could restrict that. You could require that every time you transact, you actually have to prove that you have the authority to transact. Now, the trick is you need to do that in zero knowledge, because we're now in a private domain. One way to do that is for everyone who's allowed to transact to add their public keys to a Merkle tree. Then when they want to transact, they can do a membership proof in zero knowledge that they are a member of that tree and therefore are entitled to transact. That actually works pretty well. It's a little bit of an overhead, but it's not a bad overhead. So I call that proof of allow listing, but that's just my name for it. Feel free to make up your own. Okay. Now this is quite interesting. If we look at a note commitment, such as one might use in most zero knowledge systems, this is the thing that you will put on chain. It's the hash of the value of the commitment. Usually the public key of the owner, and I've called them a recipient here because I'm thinking of, doing a transaction, but it's the owner's public key, and a load of other stuff which needn't bore us today. That's sorts and ERC addresses and things like that. What there isn't generally is the sender's public key. You could add the sender's public key, and then when you receive something, you'll know who sent it. And actually, if you've got a robust method for dealing with funds you've received from sources you don't know, which a lot of organisations do, this is actually a pretty good solution. It's quite simple, and it's quite analogous to what an organisation that is receiving payments would normally do. If you get money and you're not sure why you've got it, you stick it in a separate account and you sort it out. You don't just go and spend it, generally speaking. You could actually go further with this. You could make it part of a swap. So what I can do now is I can see this commitment, I can see who sent it, and I may decide that I don't want to complete the transaction. Well, of course, if this is half of a swap, then I just don't complete the swap. The transaction won't go through, and everything, because in a swap everything's atomic, then everything reverts to the state it was before, and we haven't done a bad transaction. That's quite a nice solution. Swaps are a little bit tricky to do under zero knowledge, but you can do them. And just a plug, Starlight can now do swaps. So if Starlight, public domain software, if you go and look at that, you can do swaps with it. So this is a possible way of controlling who sends you money, as well as knowing who sends you money. And you may say, well, Duncan, that's all very well, but look, I could put anyone's public key in this commitment. How does that prove anything? I could put the Archbishops of Canterbury's public key in there. Yes, you could, but actually you wouldn't be able to prove that you own the private key in the zero-knowledge circuit that would enforce that on you. So actually you can't do that. It's quite robust. You can make up your own key pair, but then I wouldn't recognise it, so I wouldn't transact with you. So this, I think, has legs. We'll see where it goes, and I'll be interested to hear if anyone else has some ideas along these lines. Right, we're getting towards the end now. So we talked about how one might actually nuance privacy, if you like. But there are things that I think we shouldn't do. So these are kind of anti-patterns. One solution I've seen is to have a sort of oversight key that allows some person, call them an overseer, to actually be able to de-anonymize the transactions. I mean, that is a backdoor in all but name. I don't like that. I think there are possibly situations where one can argue that will work, but there's not many of them. It has the same problem as any backdoor does. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can provide centralized AML and KYC, anti-money laundering, know your customer, using centralized components. Well, yeah, that works, but then I sort of say, well, why are you using a blockchain? Not sure. That doesn't really sit well with me. Blockchain should be decentralized. Okay. And finally, I'd like to talk about when we have to be careful with what we're doing. This is a difficult subject. Privacy can, if it goes wrong, can cause all sorts of problems for yourselves, as well as the regulator, as well as your organization. So one lesson I've learnt from Tornado Cash would be you can't use the "it's decentralized so I don't control it, therefore what happens is not my fault stroke problem" argument. That doesn't work. Look, we're all professional engineers here. We're responsible for the things we make and design. If I go and design an army of killer robots, people are going to be pissed with me, and with good reason. So remember you're a professional. Remember you're a professional engineer. When you build something, do it professionally. Be responsible. Think about how you're going to do KYC and AML, and you've had a few hints today, and be prepared to show how you've built those into your solution, so you've actually come up with something that's private, does the job, but it doesn't do it in a bad way, it does it in a good way. And I think I'll end on that note. I will see if there's any questions. What's my definition of privacy? Oh, okay, that was the slide with Alice and Bob. That's my definition of privacy. So it's basically where an eavesdropper learns nothing except a transaction has taken place. That's fully private. Now, as I've explained, privacy is nuanced and you can roll back from there, but that's fundamentally how I would define privacy. Do you have to pay fees in Ethereum? How much would it cost? Yes, you do have to pay fees in Ethereum, for sure. That's just the way it is. If you are doing a layer 2, you will still be doing a Ethereum transaction at the end of the day. It won't be a normal transaction. You'll be signing some data, but you still have to pay for that. And then you get into how much it is. Now, I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the next two talks, which are more about roll-ups. But typically, if you have privacy, if you have a roll-up, you can get things way cheap. If you add privacy, they're still cheaper than just doing things on Ethereum, but not as cheap generally as without privacy. And my sort of ballpark figure is you get about a factor of 10 saving if you do that. So, I think that's all the questions from everybody. That's good. So then that is me done. So on to the much more interesting speakers now. So my first presenter is Pearl Imbach, and she's from Matter Labs. Now, Matter Labs and I go back quite a way because I remember some years ago we were both trying to get the BLS12 curve incorporated as a Ethereum precompile because we all thought that would be a good idea. It didn't quite work out like that, but it's being used for proto-dank sharding, so I like to feel we had a bit of a moral victory. But I know them from there, so I'm very pleased to hear from them today. So hello, Pearl, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. And you basically already made a little bit of an intro to zk rollup, so I'm very happy about that.
Good stuff. Well, thank you. Well, in that case, I will let you introduce yourself properly, and please go ahead when you're ready.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll keep my intro very brief. My name is Pearl, as Duncan just said, and I lead all the TradFi business development efforts for Matter Labs. And Matter Labs is an engineering team and also the core contributors to the zkSync protocol. I'll, of course, explain you more about zkSync in this session and generally about how a rollup functions. So I'll give you an introduction to custom zk-powered blockchains. But first, I have to do something a bit boring and let you go through a little legal disclaimer. Sorry about that, my legal team.
We all have those.
Forced me. Yeah. So just take a few seconds to just read these 4 lines before I can proceed. Then I did my job for legal as well. So let me start. I'll explain to you what zkSync is. I'll explain to you as well how one can leverage or tech to build their own zk-powered blockchains. And then I'll go over some interesting use cases right now. So what do we do at zkSync? We scale Ethereum with zero-knowledge proofs. And Duncan, of course, already gave a great intro to what zero-knowledge means. And we've heard a lot about it. I'm sure it's been a lot of talks recently, and I'm sure a lot as well in the future about what zero-knowledge is. And there will be a lot more talks about it because it is, quite honestly, the only way to securely and infinitely scale blockchains. And I have to stress here, we use zero-knowledge proofs not for its confidentiality, we use it for scalability. And we are scaling Ethereum. And you may ask, and I get that question a lot, why Ethereum? Because there's many things wrong with Ethereum, people may say. But we choose Ethereum because it is fully decentralized and secure. It has more than 500,000 validators. It has thousands of full nodes. And because of that, it is slow, it is expensive. That's just a fact. But we feel like decentralization and security are just not something one can compromise. Instead, we use those 2 aspects. We think those are a strength, and we just scale it securely with zero-knowledge proofs. Other layer 1s out there, they all have to make some sort of a compromise when it comes to one of these 3 aspects. And we strongly believe that compromising on security or decentralization is just not an option. So hence we are scaling Ethereum with zero-knowledge proofs. And I'll explain to you a bit how we do that. So our layer 1 is Ethereum, as just mentioned, and we use that as our settlement layer. I also call it the custodian. I have to use my gestures here because it's of course also a legal term, but the funds are being held there. And we use Ethereum for the security aspect. What we do at zkSync is we bundle thousands of transactions that would normally cost a lot, be very slow on Ethereum. Instead, they're going through the zkSync blockchain. We bundle them, thousands. We compress this data in our sequencer, and this is being sent to our prover. And that prover then generates a zero knowledge proof. Just to go back a little bit, zero knowledge proof, I'm sure that was explained earlier, but just if you go into the definition, it is a method by which one party, which is the prover, can prove to another party, which is the verifier, that a given statement is true, while not giving any information to this verifier beyond the fact that the statement is true. And why is that so interesting? Is that it is trivial for anyone to prove possession of info by simply revealing it. But what is challenging is to prove possession of info without revealing any of this info or any of the aspect of it whatsoever. And we are exactly generating just a zero knowledge proof, which is a tiny piece of data. And we send from our prover to the verifier that is living on Ethereum this zero knowledge proof together with compressed data. So now when the verifier on Ethereum verifies this proof, they can update the state and go to the next block. So it now allows you to really scale Ethereum very efficiently. Of course, still, I just want to build a bit on the last question that was asked to Duncan. You still have to pay fees to Ethereum. That is true, but it doesn't take a whole block space. You take a bit of it, and you have thousands of transactions bundled into one. So it becomes a magnitude of thousands cheaper. Also, where we are really standing out with our tech is our prover. The prover is essential here. This prover basically allows you to trust math and trust math only. And that is very powerful. Not only is our prover now able to keep the proving cost of a transaction to less than 1/10 of a cent, it is also able to be run on consumer grade hardware. And why is that so important? It is because something so complex being able to be run on consumer grade hardware, meaning 60 gigabytes of RAM, something we could all use, makes it possible for this to be completely decentralized. Anyone can run this kind of a prover. So you're not restricted to a certain amount of big players. One of our competitors, for example, just to give a number, they're using still a prover that runs on 1 terabyte. You cannot just keep that in your living room. An enterprise cannot just run their own prover. It restricts you in a way that you would have to send your data to this gigantic prover for someone else to generate this proof for you. And at that point, you're not only using control over your data, but also this decentralization aspect, because not many enterprises can run such a huge prover. In our case, anyone can run a prover like this. Now, where do we stand? You have many different layer 2s out there in the market now. We at this point have the most activity. There's 2 good dashboards for this, L2Beat and Grow the Pie. Then you can really go and compare different chains with each other. But you will also see there, in terms of other L2s, we are general purpose and we're a ZK rollup. So we use ZK proofs. Other layer 2s are very popular, are definitely also optimistic rollups. I'm sure you're all familiar with Arbitrum and Optimism. And I won't go into Optimism, that is not here the topic, but just to give the difference with a validity or ZK proof, they use a fault proof. So they optimistically, as the name also implies, assume that these thousands of transactions are correct. They compress the data and send that data back to Ethereum, and then give quite a big amount of time, 7 days, to online actors. They give that time for them to generate a fault proof. And it's much easier for someone to generate a fault proof, say this is a lie, this is not correct, than to generate a validity proof. Validity proof, once you have a validity proof, is basically a mathematical handshake. Once that is sent to Ethereum and verified, you know this is correct. With an optimistic rollup, you're not sure that these transactions were correct, but you get 7 days to prove that one was false. which makes it not only less secure because you're not sure that one of these actors will pick up on the false one, but it also makes it that you have to wait 7 days before you can even, for example, withdraw assets. So this is a great solution as well for many DeFi NFT projects. But when it comes to enterprise adoption, TradFi, especially in my alley, this is not a viable option in the long run. So now, end of last year, we have open sourced our whole code framework to allow anyone else, any enterprise or even individual, but in this case, mostly enterprises, to use our code stack and actually customize it. And instead of having a general purpose ZK rollup, they can customize it to their business needs and build their own ZK powered blockchain. So what does that then look like? zkSync Era, which is the name of our L2, can sit next to your chain. You can have your own L2. You can decide to interact with Era or not. You can have other institutions also building their L2 and decide to interoperate with them or not. But you can use our tech and then make it fit your business requirements to make sure that it's more efficient, more effective, and really fits your needs. And now what does that mean? Especially in TradFi, that's why I made this chart here. In TradFi, you see a lot of POCs and cases so far. They have used private blockchains because they still need that privacy aspect. And I like to use the term confidentiality a bit more now. I feel like that has less of a negative connotation than privacy. But here, for me, it means that the data is not visible to everyone, but if a regulator comes in and says, hey, I need to see this data, the data does exist, it lives there and can be shared. But in a private blockchain, what is missing there? You don't have that decentralization aspect and you're lacking interoperability. And although in theory, this is very scalable tech, in practice, it doesn't scale. Why not? Because if multiple banks want to transact with each other, which is of course the case in the real world, they would have to build consortiums and then work together, have a chain together, run nodes on the same chain, and they have to trust each other. So they have to sign multilateral agreements, which is a huge amount of work. And I'm sure Ernst & Young is very well aware of how much work that is. And you have to trust all the others. And if you want to leave the network, it's also not so simple. Also, if you want other ones to join, you would have to do a lot more work. So it just doesn't scale in practice. And Ethereum is, of course, also not a viable option. It's way too expensive. It has a decentralization and security aspect, but you're missing all the other factors. Now, with zkSync, we have the decentralization and security aspect from Ethereum. We scale it infinitely. We can add the privacy aspect and the interoperability aspect. And those two things I'm going to focus a lot on in the next few slides, how we do that. So we believe our tech it's important that we build it to be future-proof. And for me, that means that especially with banks and enterprises, when you adopt such a complex tech, you want to make sure that it's around in 10 years and that it will still be relevant then. And there's quite a few aspects that come to play here. But the customizability is one of them, that you can always tailor it to your business needs. I'll start with that one first. The privacy aspect, especially for banks and also just governments, for example, they need this privacy. We can use zero knowledge proofs for privacy, but it is not what we focus on. So we have built zkSync Era really with the scaling aspect in mind. If you want to build your own chain, you can add the privacy aspect. And how do you do that? Instead of having your prover and your sequencer send compressed data and the zero knowledge proof to Ethereum, you decide, I will only send my zero knowledge proof to Ethereum and I will keep my data in-house. So the way an enterprise would operate today, you could say, I will store it on the cloud, my data. I will not send that to Ethereum. So you don't use Ethereum as your data availability layer. You just use it for the verification of your proof. And at that point, it's basically business as you know it today. You could just have your own data. No one else sees what is happening on your chain. People don't know what transactions happened, what the data on there, who the actors are that interact with you. Only you know that. And when a regulator comes in and says, hey, I need to see what actually happened, you have the whole history very accurately and you can share that. But you, as the owner of your chain, as the central operator, you hold that data. So coming to the thing of operators, you can choose as well who is the operator on your own chain. It can just be you, so it could just be a bank or the enterprise, or you could have some outsourced node operators there, or you could have other enterprises join this network and also run nodes for you. Then in terms of permissions, you could do KYC as you know it today, and then whitelist them and have permissioned access to your chain, and basically then use it as like a vaulted garden, so your clients can interact with anything that you're doing on chain, and you decide who is actually on your chain or not. You can completely permission that. You can also decide what other chains get access to yours, or who can interact or send messages. Data storage, I said before, there's now many of these data availability solutions out there. You have, of course, the things we know as of today, cloud and just on-prem, for example. But now you also have data availability layers like Near or like EigenLayer, I'm sure you heard of, Celestia. Those are all such sort of providers. And perhaps someone prefers to use those kind of chains instead of Ethereum for their data storage, because that just gets too expensive in the long run. Also, there's no crypto required. So if you build your own chain and you say, I want to use fiat or stablecoin, yes, fees still have to be paid in ETH or Ethereum, but you can have a separate smart contract running outside of your chain that is called a paymaster, and actually is able to convert whatever token or coin, whatever you use on your chain, to ETH and pay that on your behalf. So you as an enterprise do not interact with crypto. And then chain interoperability, which brings me to the next point. But network effects is important. All these blockchains now actually function in sort of islands, right? And you need those effects to really enable mass adoption in the future. So how do we do that? All these chains that are built with the zkSync tech, they can seamlessly interoperate. So any institution, they can sit next to each other. Like a consortium could look something like this. They could each have their own chain, their own regulatory framework. They can adapt it to their country's needs and whatever the regulator requires from them. They can do their own permissioning there, their own business use cases, and still interact seamlessly with other chains for certain instances. How does it work? Because every enterprise can run their own prover. I said before, that is correct. They can all have their own prover. They can all have their own sequencer. They can all store their data and keep that private if they want that. But they just have to use the same proof system. So it is the same zk circuit. So all of those chains still send proofs to Ethereum, and those validity proofs can be read by the other chains. It doesn't contain any data, but it says enough for them to be able to say, for example, oh, company A indeed burned these tokens, so I can mint that. So that is one way, for example, to transact or send messages to each other. And now what does that allow? There's a bit too much text on this slide, but of course, unified liquidity is there. And what is, for me, in the TradFi world especially interesting is that then you just can go on to signing bilateral agreements instead of multilateral agreements, and do it on a case-by-case basis. And when you want to stop interacting with another bank for whatever reason, you can stop it there without having to wind down the entire consortium, for example. Now, another thing that we believe is very important at zkSync is maybe less geared to the zero knowledge aspect of this, but we believe to really have mass adoption of blockchain tech, you need to make it more accessible, which means better user experience and making sure that developers and users really can use your tech without any issue. Web 2 UX now is great, in my opinion, but Web 3 UX is still, of course, very much lacking. And I'm not sure how many of you are interacting with blockchain tech or crypto specifically, but it is still very clunky. Like, let's say a MetaMask as of today, and let's say you want to do a DEX swap. For example, USDC against ETH, you want to swap those two. The way it goes today, not only do you have to have your own MetaMask wallet set up, you have to store your own seed phrase, you have to be the owner of that. Then you have to allow, let's say, Uniswap to use your USDC, that is a transaction, sign it. Allow Uniswap again to use your ETH, sign this transaction. Then swap it, again sign this transaction. So 3 times you had to sign. It takes a long time to do one DEX swap, and it is still very expensive, right? So now what we do, MetaMask is an externally owned account, but then you also, in the world of blockchain tech, have smart contract accounts. What we do is we do something called native account abstraction on our chain, which means that those two are basically merged. And how does that work? An externally owned account like MetaMask is an account that allows you to sign transactions and send a transaction. And a smart contract account is where you can build logic. Now, if you merge those two, it becomes very interesting, because then, for example, it's written here, familiar authentication, you would not have to use seed phrases anymore. You could basically sign in with your face the way you know it now, with your phone or with a thumbprint, and the phone knows, okay, this is indeed this person, this is my private key in a way, and then is able to send transactions on my behalf. Or you could have session key signing, meaning that instead of having to do those three different transactions, you could just bundle them all into one and sign only once. You can have transaction rules as well. So say I want to spend up maximum 10K and this person can spend 5K. You can put all those restrictions in that in the code and have that send transactions on your behalf. And then the last one, which I find very interesting, is the social recovery part as well, where now if you lost your seed phrase, you lost access to your crypto. But with this tech, you can actually have someone else hold this for you, and you can just, with your familiar authentication again, get access to your seed phrase again and use it as backup and recovery. Last one is security. We always put security first. So I wanted to mention it once more. We raised over 250 million by the end of 22, when we still spent almost 5 million on audits and bug bounties. So why that is important is any enterprise using our tech knows that this has been severely audited. We put also the largest bug bounty program out there ever, which was over 1 million on Code for Arena, and we haven't had any issues. And then lastly, I want to dive into a few use cases which I think are very interesting and also make it a bit more easy to understand what actually we are doing here. So just to identify a few verticals that have seen like the most interest in this, TradFi for sure, because as mentioned in some slides earlier, the choice mostly now was between public blockchain, really public, and then trying to figure out how to put some sort of privacy on it, or a fully private blockchain, and that also is not ideal. So now you can have a private blockchain sitting on top of Ethereum and still have full interoperability with other chains, and that is really unlocking a lot of features for banks and generally traditional financial institutions. And what they care about and how they want to configure their chain is with security first, confidentiality, permissioning, interoperability. Those four things are really crucial to them. Governments, very similar, with the fact that they also want the scalability. They need to have millions of people on there, and they're especially looking at decentralized identity. But I'll explain you a very interesting use case right after this. And then gaming and social. Gaming and social in Web3 is still very clunky now, and they need native account abstraction. So they need that good UX to be relevant for the audience. They need speed, they need low fees, and that's all possible now with zkSync. And what I think is the most interesting then with gaming and social is the fact that you own your own data, right? So otherwise, what is the upside of using Web3 over Web2? Now in games, you pick up some gadgets, you reach a new level, you actually gather all that data and you store it with you hold that data. When you then go on to another platform, so that interoperability, you go to another platform, those credentials are still valid on there, and then you can really build out your persona in a whole new way. So some interesting use cases. Those are now a few of the players that have already started building their own hyperchain with our tech. Oh, by the way, we call it a hyperchain, not because of anything like it's hyper or better than super chain, as you may know. We use it because of it's a reference to hyperlink. Like when you go on a web page and you click on the link, it redirects you to another web page within less than a second, and you don't see that transition. You're maybe on another server, a completely different page hosted by another entity, but that UX is very smooth, and that's how we see hyperchains as well, interlinking with each other. So one of the players that is building on us is a wallet provider called Quark ID, maybe very much unknown, but the use case is super interesting. They are doing this wallet for all the citizens of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And it allows all these citizens to now hold their identification documents completely decentralized in their own wallet. And so what does that mean now? All their identity information is like passport, marriage certificate, education certificate, insurance documents. They do not have to carry those documents around anymore. They have their wallet, they have their own sign-in, and they can then see all their documentation. But when someone asks them for a documentation, let's say they want to go to a bar and the bartender says, I need to see that you're really 21 or above. These people don't necessarily want to show their whole passport, which has their name, which has their address, which opens them up to all kinds of vulnerabilities. And especially in a country like that, you want to keep those things secure, and you want to be able to just prove that you're older than 21, and that's it, and nothing else. Also, these documents cannot be stolen from you anymore. Now, if you travel and you lose or your passport gets stolen, it's a whole mess to get a new one, and it's difficult. And not only does it take long, but you may just get your flight. You may not be able to get on your flight back. So it's not good UX. Now with wallet and social recovery, you'd be able to just regenerate all this info on your app. So I find it a very relevant use case, and we're talking to quite a few other countries now that want to do something similar to this. Tradable, just to give another example, they're tokenizing private credit backed by Victory Park Capital. Over $500 million commitment. And why private credit is, of course, an interesting use case is there. It's still very illiquid. They want to build a secondary market. There's still the corporate actions. They will automate all of that, and they chose to do it on zkSync Era, especially for the security aspect. Pudgy Penguins, another one is gaming, NFTs. They're one of the biggest NFT protocols out there. You may have seen, if you live in the UK or in the US and you go to like a Walmart or a Selfridges, they sell these little penguins. They're physical penguins. And when you buy them, you get also a QR code and scan it, and it gives you access to your own Pudgy Penguin NFT that you can then use to go into Pudgy World, which is all built on zkSync, and it'll be a game where you can then explore things with your penguin. And yeah, it all sounds a bit gimmicky, but it's a very cool project. Fidelity tokenized the money market fund on zkSync Era. We announced that just a few weeks ago. They did it together with Signum. Signum actually did the tokenization for them. That's a Swiss crypto bank. Space and Time, very interesting AI protocol backed by Microsoft. They're building their own chain on zkSync stack, so they will have their own hyperchain, and they will use this exclusively to verify all the zk proofs from other chains. And then Lemon Cash is a payment provider in LATAM, especially. Payments is a very interesting use case for this as well, just especially for the security, of course, but the low fees, very important, the interoperability, very important, UX as well. So payments has become very important to us. There's many more right now being built, but I'm almost out of time. So I just wanted to leave my contact information with you as well. So you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or email me at pi.matterlabs.dev. And I'm always happy to answer questions or give a bit more insight. And I hope this intro, it's really an intro. I kept it quite general. I hope to once do a bit of bigger deep dive if you'd like that. But I hope it was interesting, and I'm always happy to answer more questions.
Pearl, that was brilliant. Thank you. And it was indeed very interesting. I enjoyed that very much. It's amazing to see how zkSync has developed over recent years, and just the capabilities that you have. We do have a few questions actually, but one of the advantages of sitting in this chair is I get to ask mine first. And so I was very interested when you put up the sort of list of other roll-ups. Now, some of them are optimistic, and one of the advantages of an optimistic roll-up has always been it's very compute-light compared to doing a zk solution. But having seen your other slides, it looks like that advantage is being rapidly eroded. Do you see a time when there will only be zk roll-ups and optimism will have been retired, or do you think they will continue to coexist?
Well, there's two things I want to use to answer this question. One is that other optimistic rollups, they have already publicly announced that they are looking at zk. So they would want to add zk proofs to their existing solution, because they realize it's the only way to infinitely scale, and they can't interoperate without zk proofs. So the only way this hyper bridging that I showed you can work is through zero knowledge proof. So they have already publicly said that they're working on this, and they will basically converted to a zk rollup. My CEO always likes to jokingly say it's like putting a jet engine onto a Zeppelin, but let's see, they are working on it. Then second, we have seen now with the 4844 upgrade with now the blobs, that it has been beneficial for them just because of what you just mentioned. They now can use Ethereum much more efficiently for their data availability, while we didn't really need that. So it has put them a bit relatively an advantage now. But again, in the long run, when you really get much more mass adoption and you want to rely less and less and less on Ethereum, it will have to be through zero knowledge proofs.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. And I think we've just got time for one quick question. Somebody's asking if you've launched a zkSync token yet, and if not, are you going to?
Everyone is asking us that. That is like the question. I'm now in Dubai. It's token 2049, and when token is the main question I'm getting. But our CEO has been very vocal on the fact that we are going to fully decentralize. And of course, with a decentralized sequencer comes a token. So that's all I can say. Keep an eye on it, but it's definitely, it has to happen.
Well, I think we'll end on that suitably diplomatic answer. And thank you very much, Pearl. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, bye for now. Right, so we'll move on to our next speaker, who is sitting next to me. This is Nico Montblat from Geometry. Now, I think Geometry needs no introduction to this audience. So I won't. But you're going to give us an overview of zero knowledge proof research and where it's going and things like that, aren't you? Excellent. Well, I look forward to that, and I'll leave it to you, Nico.
Thank you.
Okay. You have a clicker here.
Amazing.
You're ready.
Thanks. So my talk today is called The Big Move, and I'm going to be telling you the story of moving from Web 2 to Web 3 and moving your identity from Web 2 to Web 3 with cryptography. But behind that, what I'm really talking about today is how to use zero knowledge proofs for identity. So the buzzwords here are zkID, maybe, that people have been using so far. As Duncan says, I'm Nicolas Montblat from Geometry Research. I'll tell you a bit more about the organization in a minute. So in today's talk, there we go. I want to give you a quick look ahead of what to expect. So first, we're going to see how and why would we want to use Web3, this sort of blockchain-based internet, with our existing traditional internet credentials. To do this, we're going to categorize Web2 data into 3 types. And I'm going to explain what I mean by strongly authenticated, weakly authenticated, and loose data. And now, for each of these types, we're going to go over cryptographic constructions for how to attest to the truthness of that data. What I won't be covering is, once I've moved that data into this blockchain-based internet, how do I use it as anonymous credentials? And if you're interested in this, there's a great paper called zkSync, which I'm happy to refer you to, or sorry, not zkSync, that was the talk just before, zkCreds, apologies. zkCreds, which I highly recommend you read. I'm also not going to cover all use cases and applications that you unlock once you move your data, but there are a lot around us, and hopefully you'll have some ideas as well. The talk in a single chart, this is what we are going to be doing. We have our 3 types of data: strongly authenticated, weakly authenticated, and loose. We are going to develop sort of a flow chart of how to decide what kind of data we're dealing with. And once we figured out what data we're dealing with, we'll have a very specific cryptographic technique for how to port this over to our new Web3 internet. Great. So briefly, before we start, a few words about Geometry Research, the organization I'm a part of. We are a team of experts, researchers, cryptographers, software engineers, and we build, integrate, we audit, we try to improve the latest cryptographic protocols and primitives. I'll invite you to visit our website and contact us if you have any questions about cryptography in general or this talk even today. So a bit of motivation to get started. This is the how and why would we want to move our credentials. We'll start with our good friend Alice, who I think Duncan mentioned earlier. Alice lives in Web 2, and I have here this little house, and this house represents Alice's data. This is all her accounts in existing websites. She might have, a Google account, a Facebook account. All these things live in Web 2. And Web 2 is great because it's pretty safe and very familiar. But there are also some issues with it. Alice is very aware of the fact that Web 2 is owned by a few big actors. Most of her data resides on a Google Drive. If Google goes down, so does her data. She's also aware that Web 2 is rife with surveillance. And this is hopefully not new to anyone, but Web 2 unfortunately has this model where the more companies know about their users, the more money they can make. So although Alice has this safe house, whenever she walks around, she is observed. So she's thinking, should I move to Web 3? So we have this maybe Alice in Web 3, and we have a few boxes. And the boxes now don't represent Alice's house. They represent sort of the minimal data that Alice would need to bring with her to use Web 3 meaningfully. Why would she want to go there? Well, there are nice promises of equality. Web 3 is decentralized. Everyone is the same. There are promises of riches. Bitcoin hit an all-time high. Dog with hat is pumping. Alice loves this stuff. And there's also a promise of freedom, censorship resistance, and again, decentralization. So Web 3 sounds great. However, there are some dangers. One is that Web 3 is still under construction. The infrastructure itself, but also our understanding of it, the regulation. And this is why I'm guessing we're having summits like these. Web 3 in itself is very dangerous. There are a lot of bad actors running around, a lot of Ponzi schemes and rug pulls. It's also dangerous in that any small mistake can be very costly. You can send all your money to an empty address, or you could lose your private key. Most of all, the biggest danger with Web 3 for Alice, and I think for most of us, is that we don't understand it. As much as an expert as we want to be, Web 3 is nascent, it's still emergent, and we are yet to fully understand what it is we're building here. So should Alice move? Well, not just yet. She's not going to build a house. The house might break down. But she can go with her boxes. And ideally, she can safely explore Web 3 with her existing credentials and identity. And she could even forget about it, leave Web 3, and leave these boxes there, because those boxes are safe and secure via cryptography. Once Alice is ready, and once Web 3 is ready, she can come back to this spot where she left her boxes and use Web 3 properly. And this is only possible if Alice can explore Web 3 using her data privately. Great. So the first item that Alice wants to bring, and this is going to be the recurring theme throughout this talk, is we're going to talk about these different items that Alice is bringing with her. The first one is credentials. She wants to sign in to Web 3 apps using her Google account. Alice doesn't know about wallets. She doesn't know about mnemonics. She doesn't care about writing down 12 words, 24 words, whatever. That should not happen. And so how do we sign into apps with our Google account? Well, this is what it would look like in our regular Web 2 world, right? I want to sign in to, say, Notion, and I'll get this prompt from Google. What I'm seeing here is actually a prompt for the OpenID protocol. And how this works under the hood is a bit like this. We have Google at the top, who has their private key signing. And they're going to sign a message. And this message contains information about themselves, the issuer is Google, about the audience, some application, and importantly, information about Alice. We're going to have Alice's email, whether or not Google verified that email. There's going to be information like Alice's given name, all these things. Google signs this little, we call it a JSON web token. So it signs this JWT and gives the token and the signature to Alice. Now, Alice can forward this signature to the app. And upon verification of the signature, the app knows, yes, I am dealing with someone who Google thinks is Alice. You may now use my service as Alice. Great. So can we do the same thing to sign into a Web 3 app? And the challenge is, what happens when Alice starts publishing this message and this signature, right? If we think about it, if Alice suddenly publishes her token, this message signature, onto a chain, anyone who picks it up could log in as her. So luckily, these tokens have expiration dates, but for a short period, she can be impersonated. So we don't want to reveal the message nor the signature. What can we do? Hopefully, by now, after these first 2 talks, you're familiar with what a zero-knowledge proof is. So Alice is going to say, you know what? I know a message signed by Google, and the signature is correct. And I know a message such that, and here I can insert whatever application logic I want. So the logic could be my email address is the same one that I committed to somewhere else. The logic could be the token from Google is not expired, or my email address was verified by Google. This proof, by virtue of being zero knowledge, doesn't reveal anything other than the truthness of the statement. So this proof can be put on a blockchain with no privacy risk for Alice. Now, when a smart contract verifies the proof, they will know, just like the Web2 app knew, that they are dealing with someone who Google authenticates as being Alice. Or in this case, zero knowledge authenticates as being a valid user with no other information. Great. These systems are described and developed and put out under the names OpenPubKey, zkLogin by Sui, or Aptos Keyless by Aptos. And I have to say here, Geometry Research has helped Aptos with their circuit for the zero-knowledge proof. All right, so we have a way to log in. Second item that Alice wants to bring is an email. She wants to convince a Web3 app of the contents of an email. And why would she want to do that? Well, emails contain useful information. They could be receipts, they could be subscription agreements, tickets. So here I have actually my registration for this event. And if I could prove that I've received this email, I can prove that I am actually someone attending the event. The problem is email is not authenticated by default. Email is just plain text. Luckily, recent fights against spoofing and phishing have introduced signatures. They're not perfect, but we have signatures in email. And actually, if you look at this screenshot of the email, we have EY Global Blockchain. So that is a name that the sender chose for themselves. This name could be anything. We can't trust this. But on the right, you might see lighter characters. And these lighter characters are only displayed to me by Gmail because they verified a signature. And they know that the email does come from ey.com. And so this process is known as DKIM, which stands for Domain Key Identified Mail. So in the name domain key, we know that the email is identified with respect to some domain, not a sender. So we don't know who sent it, but we know that the domain is, let's say, ey.com. So again, we can do a zero-knowledge proof of knowledge, attesting that some sender sent an email, that they've signed with their domain key, and that the email contains specific information. And this is what a company called zkEmail does. Hopefully this diagram is somewhat similar to the previous one, and you should be seeing a pattern emerging here, where we have someone with a key sending a message and a signature to Alice, and Alice producing a proof. And so this brings us to the third item that Alice can bring with her. It's anything that was signed. And so this is actually what I mean by strongly authenticated data, is whenever we have a digital signature, we have something that is strongly authenticated, and we can migrate it or attest to it using a zero-knowledge proof. And again, the proof is, 1, that the signature is valid, and 2, that the message meets certain application-specific conditions. Great. So now we've seen strongly authenticated data. Let's move to something else. And we'll see what type of data we're talking about in just a second. So now Alice wants to convince us of her account balance. She wants to go on an exchange and do stuff with money. So she wants to prove that her balance is positive. And luckily enough, Alice has a nice dashboard from her bank where she can see all her balances. And this is a stock image, so don't pay attention to name, accounts. We're not doxing anyone here. So can we use this as proof in any way? And all right, we might not have a signature, but Alice was using HTTPS. The little S means secure. So surely there must be some kind of authentication going on. So yes, there is authentication, and this is what it looks like. We have a server from the bank and Alice. They are both engaged in a TLS session, the TLS protocol, which you might have heard of. The TLS protocol uses symmetric keys for encryption and authentication, simply because it's much faster than public keys like we have in digital signatures. So now the question is, all right, we have this session going on. What could Alice send to a blockchain? What can we prove? So the problem is, both Alice and the server have the session key. So both of them can authenticate messages. So if Alice were to write a proof, the proof would actually say, I know a message authenticated by the server or myself, such that whatever you want in there. Unfortunately, we can't trust Alice to make statements about herself. So how do we break this up? Well, the solution is we make sure that Alice cannot know the session key. So this probably sounds a bit weird, right? If Alice doesn't know the session key, how do we have this TLS session? And here we introduce a new cryptographic primitive known as MPC, multi-party computation. So the idea is that Alice and a verifier will work together and pretend to be a TLS client. So Alice and the verifier each have a share of a key. So this is represented here with Alice having the yellow share and the verifier has the blue share. If these keys are combined, we get the session key, the same one that the server knows. As we said, we want to make sure that Alice never sees the other half. Why is it also important that the verifier never learns Alice's share? Well, Alice might be protecting some information. She doesn't want the verifier to know her password to log into her bank. So it's important that the verifier also never has full access to the session key. How does Alice still participate in the TLS session? Well, she and the verifier will have to jointly compute encryption and jointly compute authentication with their key shares. And this is what the MPC is for. Once that is done and once the TLS session is over, we can revert to our good old zero-knowledge proof, like, hey, I know a message that was authenticated using the session key, and the message contained information such that X, Y, and Z. Now, the downsides to this approach is that here the verifier, as you see, is interacting with Alice. The verifier has to hold a secret state. It has to know this key share and has to never reveal it to Alice. This is something that a smart contract cannot do, right? In the previous case, we had a zero-knowledge proof. It's non-interactive. Alice submitted a proof. Smart contract verifies proof. In this case, Alice and the verifier need to run together all the time. So this is not something a smart contract can do, and this is kind of one of the open problems we have at the moment with this construction, is how do we get rid of this important role of the verifier? Another thing to note is that the verifier is designated. The only person who can trust the zero-knowledge proof is the person who knows for sure that Alice doesn't have the full session key. So in this case, the only person is our verifier here. Any third party observing this won't care to hear about the zero-knowledge proof. This proof won't mean anything to them. Maybe the verifier leaked the key. So this is the other area of concern, is that these proofs are for a designated verifier. One thing to note is that in this whole discussion, we never used the fact that Alice was speaking to her bank. She was just speaking to any TLS server. So this is item number 5, is that, in fact, Alice can do this for any web page served over TLS. And this was first described in a paper called DECO. And I have the full reference at the end on the slide if you're interested. And there are a lot of follow-on works, including one by Paddle Labs, one by the Brave browser team called Di Stefano, and there's an effort called TLS Notary, which is also supported by the Ethereum Foundation. To note, which I should have written on the slide, this is what I mean by weakly authenticated data. This is data where there are maybe more than one party who can authenticate it. So strongly authenticated, it's a digital signature, only the party with a private key can sign. Weakly authenticated is something like a message authentication code. And there may be, message authentication code. And there are two parties who have the session key. And there's a question that just came up, which I will take on right now. What if the verifier is malicious? That's a great question, actually. And this is kind of the importance of making sure the verifier doesn't have the full session key either. With only a partial key share, the verifier cannot read Alice's messages in full without Alice participating. The multi-party computation also prevents the verifier from learning Alice's secrets. So the only thing that a malicious verifier could do is deny service, essentially, is to pretend they're verifying and say, no, Alice doesn't have a positive balance in her bank account. The proof doesn't verify. That is kind of the worst that could happen with a malicious verifier. So item 5, anything in a TLS session, but this would also work for anything that has a MAC, message authentication code, on it. So a quick summary so far. Alice can set up Web3 accounts with her existing OpenID credentials. She can also make claims about herself using signatures on email. So this is all strongly authenticated data, and this is easy, proof of knowledge of a signature, or stuff that it's in, or data that is in a TLS session. And in this case, we are dealing with weakly authenticated data. And as we saw, attesting to this requires more effort cryptographically, but also in terms of our assumptions and who can verify this. So now the next step is Alice is in Web3. She's done all these proofs. She wants to interact with her friends. I'll also take, just before we go on, another online question about the previous construction. Could Alice use an LLM agent to act as Alice in the MPC interactivity? So in general, when we describe MPC protocols, we don't expect the human being Alice to be clicking things and writing messages and interacting. So we'll have software that does this, and we'll have sort of a client that runs. And we don't need this to be an LLM, because this is kind of well-known protocols, well-established formats, and so we know exactly what message needs to be sent. Right. So back to where we were. Alice wants to interact with her friends. And this is, for example, she wants to speak with her contacts, so people she knows in her address book, but find them on a new messaging app. Or she would like to migrate her followers from x.com to a different social network. Or maybe she would want to make payments to her friends, knowing only their phone number, without knowing their address, because blockchain addresses are impossible to remember, let's face it. So this is item number 6, and this is what I call loose data. Can Alice transfer her address book into Web3? And here I'm going to talk about research that we've been leading at Geometry Research. This is a paper we put out about a year ago in collaboration with Alberto Sonino from Miston Labs and Filip Jovanovic from UCL, and Kobe Gherkin, also from Geometry Research. The architecture I'm going to describe here is also used in another 2 papers, which are sort of concurrent work, and I'll discuss all of them in a second. So the problem we're trying to deal with is I want to find users that are signed up to a service. So for example, I sign up to Signal, and I want to find all my contacts that also use Signal. So the problem looks a bit like this diagram here. We have a set of contacts, a set of all users of the service, and we want to know the intersection. Importantly, I have all users as a dotted line, because in some cases, there might not be a set of all users, or we might not know who all users are. The second problem, slightly related, is to find someone's address from their phone number or their identifier. So for example, making a payment to someone's phone number or to someone's email. Importantly, we want to do this with privacy. Alice went through all this work to create blockchain accounts from her email without revealing her email. Why would she start revealing it now? So she doesn't want to reveal this mapping between her Web2 identifiers and her Web3 identifiers. She also does not want to reveal her contacts because her address book is private. So the idea that we had, and the idea that is also pursued in these other 2 papers, is that users should establish a secure communication channel with each other without knowing anything else than their phone numbers or their identifiers, and use this channel to exchange the required information. The ingredients we use for this are firstly a key exchange, because that's how we know to do encryption, and then a message board through which we can pass messages anonymously. And so the system looks a bit like this. We'll have Alice and Bob, 2 users. In step 1, they will each individually interact with a discovery service. In the case of our paper, they interact with a decentralized service to obtain cryptographic material, some sort of randomized identifier. Now, using this randomized identifier, they can go on to step 2, which is key derivation. So Alice will use her sort of randomized identifier and Bob's identifier to derive some secret value. Similarly, Bob will use his randomized identifier with Alice's phone number and derive the same secret value that Alice derived. So this is a key exchange. They both get to the same secret. Having the same secret, they can encrypt messages and pass them through this anonymous message board, which is steps 3 and 4 of write and read. What we did in our construction is completely eliminate the need for public keys. In other papers, such as, so these are the 3 papers, UDM, RKey, and Pudding. RKey is the one that we've put out. The difference is, in the case of Pudding, they allow people to contact friends even if the friend has not registered. Sorry, the other way around. So I can contact a friend if the friend is registered, but I'm not. So this is great for a whistleblower, for example. I'm a whistleblower. I want to contact a journalist. As long as the journalist is registered, I can contact them, but I don't need to register with a service. The other 2 constructions, UDM and UDM and RKey, only allow mutual discovery. So people have to discover each other. And what we've done with RKey is we've eliminated the need for public keys. We use only phone numbers. Great. Actually, I will say, finally, the techniques here are kind of ad hoc, and they're specific to the fact that we are using phone numbers. They're specific to the fact that we are trying to do this friend matching thing. If we were trying to implement a different functionality, we would need some different kind of cryptography. And this is kind of what I want to get to with the summary. We are back to our chart. And what we saw is, if we look at data, we can ask ourselves, is it authenticated? Yes or no? And at first, we looked at authenticated data. And then we said, what kind of cryptography are we using? If it's public key cryptography, we have strongly authenticated data. And in this case, we can attest to it very easily using a zero-knowledge proof. Right? We prove knowledge of a signature and a message such that the signature is valid and the message meets certain conditions. If we didn't have public key cryptography, if we had symmetric key, we needed to do a bit more work, right? We needed to do this MPC to take the symmetric key away from the person trying to authenticate something, trying to, attest something. So this is the plan. We do not give the prover full access to the symmetric key. We use MPC, or in some cases, trusted hardware, to allow the protocol to proceed as if the prover had the key. The reason I didn't really mention trusted hardware up until now is because, as cryptographers, we try to stay away from that. And finally, we had loose data, data that's not authenticated, like your address book. And in that case, the cryptography is very ad hoc. It depends on the data, and it depends on the privacy requirements. So quick summary, yes, we saw OpenID and DKIM fall under strongly authenticated. TLS is weakly authenticated, and address books are loose data. I would also like to bring up other examples that we didn't cover here, but passports are strongly authenticated data. And I think Pearl was mentioning Cork ID that uses zero-knowledge proofs for government-issued identity documents. They probably use something like this. Other ideas that I've had and that I wish people would explore a bit more is things like open banking, which is a protocol for the passing of banking information, or eSIMs, which is the fact that you can download a SIM on your phone. These things do use cryptographic authentication. I am not sure if it's public key or symmetric key, but I think there's interesting protocols to be developed by going into the details of open banking and eSIM. If you do so, you could have a zero-knowledge proof of ownership of a phone number, and you can forget all these texts, sending you challenges like, please confirm your phone number. That would be gone. And I think that's it for me. I have a few references that I mentioned. Sadly, I don't have zk creds on here, but I'll make sure to provide links if people ask. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Nico. That was brilliant. It's usually when you talk about zkP, you have a problem like transferring value, and you're trying to make it more and more efficient. But it's really interesting to see a talk where you're actually expanding out the things you can do with zkP. Yes. I really like that. And having in a previous life worked for Her Majesty's Passport Office, I was really pleased you mentioned passports, because I was thinking this would be really good for passports.
Exactly. So marrying this with something like zkCreds, which gives you infrastructure to verify these things, and turns your passport into anonymous credentials, is for me like the next big step for zk and identity.
Yeah, great. So we do have a couple of questions. So there's an interesting question about the cost of verifying the zkP, if you have to do it lots of times.
Absolutely. I think I'm glad actually Pearl was on just before, because she mentioned account abstraction, and this is what we can do here. You can log in once, verify the proof once, and then account abstraction does the rest of the magic for you. So you would only need to verify the proof once in a while.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. There's a question about protecting against man-in-the-middle attacks. I'm not quite sure what the questioner was thinking about there.
So if we're talking about authenticating TLS data, this is kind of protected, like TLS is already protected against man-in-the-middle attacks. And this is where we have to go through this weird construction of having Alice and the verifier share the key and do MPC. Other protocols suggest like, oh, let's have a verifier between Alice and the server, acting as a man in the middle themselves. But then we either lose privacy for Alice, or we lose security against network attackers. Yeah. So Alice could man in the middle, the man in the middle, right? Like that would be
brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and thanks for popping in.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So. We're going to take a break now, so we will be back in about 15 minutes. So we will see you all then. Bye for now.